There is a frame in the files that the Pentagon just released that I had to examine twice to be sure of what I was reading. A single frame, captured by an orbital sensor at classified altitude, where the recorded object executes a maneuver that analysts who reviewed the material describe as physically impossible within the models we know. Not difficult, not rare, impossible. And what's most disturbing is not what appears in that frame. It's what the American government did with it for years, kept it, classified it, and denied it existed. Until a law they didn't expect anyone to read, a paragraph buried in a 2,000-page document of military spending, legally forced them to release it. I'm Daniel, an analyst with 12 years tracking classified intelligence programs and congressional disclosures about UAPs. On July 26, 2023, I watched live David Grush's testimony before American Congress and took 50 pages of notes. That day, Grush made specific, verifiable claims, not about abstract aliens, but about concrete programs, real documentation, and a suppression system deliberately built to ensure you never found out. Today, the first data released under the expedited declassification mandate of the 2024 NDAA confirms precisely what he said. Let's be clear about what this means. We're not talking about another shaky video of a confused pilot. We're not talking about ambiguous imagery that could be a balloon, could be a drone, could be light reflection. We're talking about military orbital sensor data, automatically collected, time-stamped, corroborated by multiple independent instruments, showing an object with performance characteristics that no known human technology can replicate. 3 questions will structure everything we're going to cover today. First, what exactly is in this footage, and why can't it be explained by any available conventional means? Second, what was the thesis that this footage supposedly proves, and what did Grush specifically claim to Congress so we can now verify each point? Third, why is the government releasing this now, after more than 50 years of systematic institutional silence? Each of these questions has an answer. And the third, why now, is the most disturbing of all. Because the answer is not that the government decided to be transparent. The answer is that a law forced them to. And that fundamentally changes how you should interpret everything that's coming out. If you've ever felt that the official answers don't add up, that there's a gap between what we know exists and what we're told exists, what we're covering today is proof that you were right, and it will show exactly how the gap was constructed. To understand why the release of these files is extraordinary, you need to understand the infrastructure built to ensure it never happened. I'm not talking about informal secrecy, slow bureaucracy, data lost in a drawer. I'm talking about a deliberate system with specific mechanisms built over 7 decades to contain exactly this kind of disclosure. It all starts in July of 1947. On the 8th of that month, the Public Relations Department of Roswell Air Force Base, New Mexico, issued an extraordinary statement. The American Army had recovered the wreckage of a flying disc. The news ran around the world. 24 hours later, a second statement replaced the first. It was a weather balloon. The sequence, revelation, institutional panic, retraction, would become the template for every significant UAP event over the next 50 years. What the declassified military files on Roswell revealed decades later is that there were multiple internal reports of unidentified material recovered. Those reports never appeared in public statements. Project Blue Book was the next step in the architecture. Operated by the American Air Force between 1952 and 1969, Blue Book investigated 12,618 reported UAP incidents. This number was actively used as proof of scientific rigor. Nearly 13,000 cases examined, nearly all explained. What the declassified Blue Book files themselves show is different. Internal analysts documented cases that they themselves classified as unknowns, incidents that, after full investigation, didn't fit any available explanation. These cases totaled 701 in all and were systematically downplayed in public reports. Blue Book was not an investigation. It was a public perception management operation with a scientific veneer. In 1969, the Condon Report made Blue Book publicly expendable. Funded by the Air Force, conducted by the University of Colorado, published with the weight of academic credibility. The conclusion: the scientific study of UFOs would probably yield no significant gains. The project was ended. Coverage was widely positive. Science had examined the problem and found nothing of interest. What emerged years later is Condon's internal memo to the project coordinator, written before the investigation began, describing what the conclusion would be. The conclusion was already drafted before the data was collected. The data was gathered to justify it. The template established in 1947 worked for 3 decades without significant disruption. Each credible incident was processed through the same sequence. An official explanation plausible enough for public consumption, institutional silence toward analysts who questioned that explanation, and systematic isolation of the most credible witnesses. Then came the Nimitz. In November 2004, the strike group of the USS Nimitz carrier conducted air combat training 100 miles off the coast of Southern California. The onboard radar systems, calibrated and operated by highly trained personnel trained in distinguishing between real targets and sensor artifacts, detected objects descending from 24,000 meters altitude to sea level in a matter of seconds. A deceleration of that magnitude contradicts any known aerodynamic performance profile, military or civilian. Commander David Fravor, a fighter pilot with 18 years of service and hundreds of combat mission hours, was dispatched for visual investigation. What he described upon his return burned itself into the memory of every pilot present. A white, oval-shaped object, with no visible lifting surfaces, no identifiable propulsion system, no infrared engine signature, executing maneuvers at speeds that should have destroyed any known physical structure. The accompanying aircraft's FLIR system captured the object on video. That video remained classified for 13 years. When the U.S. Navy confirmed the authenticity of the Nimitz video in 2019, the institutional statement chose a very specific formulation: the recorded phenomena remain unidentified. In the vocabulary of the Department of Defense, this phrase is not an admission of scientific curiosity. It is the only formulation that allows the DoD to provide no explanation without technically lying. They don't know what it is, or they know and cannot say. In either case, unidentified is the limit of what they will confirm publicly. What the Nimitz revealed that transcends the incident itself is the suppression apparatus operating in real time. Fravor learned, through other pilots, that the object had been tracked by onboard radars for more than 2 weeks before his mission. This radar data, 2 weeks of telemetry of an unidentified object recorded by the most sophisticated equipment in the U.S. Navy, disappeared. The onboard storage hard drives were physically removed by unknown personnel who presented themselves to the crew without verifiable identification. Intelligence files that operational protocols determined should remain on board were carried away in hand luggage. This pattern, physical retrieval of evidence through channels the regular crew didn't recognize, is the detail that distinguishes the Nimitz from a simple sighting. It's not just that something was seen and filmed. It's that someone knew far enough in advance to have a retrieval mechanism in place. This mechanism operated exactly as it should to ensure that the most significant data never reached the public record. In 2017, the New York Times revealed the existence of AATIP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, a secret Pentagon program that had studied UAPs from 2007 to 2012, with $22 million in funding. With the report came the first 3 declassified videos: Nimitz, Gimbal, and Go Fast. The government had conducted a formal investigation of UAPs in secret for years, while publicly asserting that the subject didn't deserve serious investigation. The wall didn't collapse in 2017, but a crack appeared that could no longer be covered. And that crack was what made what came next not just possible, but inevitable. David Grush was not a UFO enthusiast with a theory. He was an intelligence officer in the U.S. Air Force with a portfolio of credentials that made institutionally ignoring him far more difficult than ignoring a civilian witness. A graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, a veteran of intelligence missions in Afghanistan, former Air Force representative to the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and the National Reconnaissance Office, the 2 agencies responsible for remote sensing systems, satellite, and classified imagery collection of the American government. Member of the Interagency UAP Task Force created in 2019. Holder of the highest-level security clearance for more than a decade. When Grush resigned, he hired a lawyer specialized in legal protection for government whistleblowers and proceeded through formal channels, reporting to the Inspector General of the intelligence community before testifying publicly. It was because what he had to say was specific enough to demand legal precision and potentially dangerous enough to demand formal protection. On July 26, 2023, Grush testified before the House Oversight Subcommittee of the U.S. House of Representatives. The bipartisan and multi-channel context of the testimony was deliberate. It wasn't a hearing about theories. It was a congressional oversight session with witnesses under oath. What Grush said that day organized itself into 4 specific, distinct, and verifiable statements. The first, the American government possesses vehicles of non-human origin, not images, not telemetry. Physical vehicles, whole or in fragments, currently in the custody of classified programs. Grush claimed to have reviewed primary documentation and received briefings from multiple officials with direct access to those programs. He said there were more than 40 people willing to testify on the same subject if legally protected. The second claim, active reverse engineering programs of those vehicles exist within Special Access Programs, SAPs. You need to understand what this classification level means. SAP is not just top secret. It's a layer above top secret, where access is not determined by clearance level, but by a nominally controlled list. A 4-star general doesn't have access to a SAP simply by being a general. They need to be on the list. These programs have their own funding that can be channeled through contracts with private defense companies, making them invisible to regular congressional budget oversight. Grush claimed that this is exactly how the reverse engineering programs operate, deliberately constructed to stay out of sight of normal democratic oversight. The third claim, the darkest, was the existence of an institutionally sanctioned disinformation campaign, not individual officials downplaying incidents out of caution or bureaucratic inertia. A deliberate program with resources approved at some level of the intelligence apparatus to actively shape what the public and congressional members believed about UAPs. Grush said that he himself had been targeted by attempts to publicly discredit his claims through channels that were not independent. The fourth claim closed the loop. Personnel involved in these programs had faced coercion, intimidation, and retaliation when they tried to report what they knew through legal channels. Grush cited cases of individuals who lost security clearances, individuals who were forced into early departure, individuals subjected to psychological and legal pressure to ensure silence. But the most significant technical detail of the testimony, what transformed Grush's position from official with an opinion to official with legally blocked access, was the matter of oversight. As the Air Force's representative at the NGA and NRO, Grush had legal authority to oversee programs within the scope of those agencies. When he tried to exercise that authority to review the programs he described, when he tried, with formal documentation and within his official capacity, to obtain access to what oversight laws entitled him to, he was denied. An official with legal oversight authority was blocked from overseeing. That, in itself, is a constitutional scandal independent of any other claim. It's not a theory about non-humans, it's a claim about the chain of democratic accountability that governs how the most classified programs of the American government are overseen. And the claim is that this chain was deliberately cut. The American government had multiple opportunities to respond with a direct denial. It did not respond that way. The Pentagon issued a statement saying there was no available evidence to corroborate Grush's claims. Notice what that statement doesn't say. It doesn't say the claims are false. It doesn't say the programs don't exist. It says there is no available evidence, a formulation that leaves completely open the possibility that evidence exists but is not available to the personnel who drafted the statement. This falsifiable thesis, specific programs exist, with specific documentation, with specific personnel, and when you try to access them through the correct legal channels, you'll discover you can't, because they were deliberately constructed to stay beyond the reach of formal oversight. Now has satellite data pointing in the same direction. When the American Congress passed the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2024, most news coverage focused on the big numbers of military spending, negotiations over weapon systems, the usual political adjustments of a 2,000-page document, a specific clause, technically detailed, with no visual appeal for a headline, with coverage only in specialized defense policy publications, passed through the filters of mainstream media almost without a trace. This clause is the reason why the satellite files were released now. The 2024 NDAA contains a mandate for expedited declassification of records related to UAPs. It's not a recommendation for the Department of Defense to consider greater transparency. It's not a non-binding request. It's a legal obligation, with a timeline, with congressional oversight, and with accountability mechanisms. The Pentagon is legally compelled to review and present to Congress specific records related to UAPs within determined timeframes. To understand why this is fundamentally different from anything that came before, you need to understand how the classification process normally works. Under normal conditions, a federal agency that wishes to keep a file classified needs to do just one thing: claim that its disclosure would harm national security. This claim requires no independent proof. It's not subject to a deadline. There is no effective appeal mechanism. The practical result is that files remain classified indefinitely. Not because the classification justification is continuously valid, but because no one has the legal authority to force a review. The system, by design, favors retention. The UAP clause in the 2024 NDAA inverts that design, and it has an exact historical precedent that every American with an interest in politics knows: the JFK Records Act of 1992. When Congress passed that law, in the wake of Oliver Stone's film about Kennedy's assassination, it created the same essential mechanism: a mandatory deadline, a review authority with independent power, a legal presumption of openness instead of a legal presumption of secrecy. The effect was that, over the following years, documents began to come out of vaults that the CIA, FBI, and Secret Service had actively fought to keep closed. Some files took decades to come out fully. Some still face resistance, but the mechanism forced movement that wouldn't have occurred voluntarily. History is rhyming with an almost uncomfortable precision. The legislators who inserted the UAP clause into the 2024 NDAA included members of both parties. an unusual bipartisan coalition that signaled that pressure for disclosure had crossed the threshold where it could be treated as one-sided agenda. The stronger version of the language was softened in negotiations, as invariably happens in large-scale legislative processes. But the core remained. The Department of Defense must review and release. It can no longer simply file away and deny. The DoD's initial response was the institutional equivalent of a child pressured to clean his room. Lots of superficial activity, little substance, slow reviews, narrow archival scope, inconsistent process documentation, but the law offers no option of indefinite non-compliance. It has deadlines, and missed deadlines before congressional oversight have documented political consequences. The detail that most analyses ignore is what the word expediting itself reveals as implicit admission. You cannot expedite a process that was occurring at normal speed. This vocabulary presupposes there was a prior, slower pace, a pace deliberately slower than what the law now requires. When the government uses this language, it's acknowledging that the files existed and were being processed at suboptimal speed. The question it raises is simple. Why? If satellite data shows adversary drones, atmospheric phenomena, or other findings with mundane explanations, why was the classification so resistant that it required legislation to be moved? Files without consequence don't require special declassification laws. The fact that the law was necessary is, in itself, evidence that what was being protected was not mundane. And there's another angle that conventional coverage consistently ignores. The JFK Act created a mechanism for a specific set of files. The UAP clause in the 2024 NDAA is structurally broader. It covers continuous record categories with permanent congressional oversight. The pipeline that's opening now is not a one-time process. It's a disclosure mechanism that will continue operating long after this week's news dies. The All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office has a name that sounds like routine bureaucratic data processing for a deliberate reason. When AARO was established in July 2022 within the Department of Defense, the office's architects understood that UFO Investigation Center would generate immediate institutional resistance. All-Domain Anomaly Resolution sounds like routine technical function. The name is camouflage. AARO's mandate was to centralize all UAP reports from the U.S. government, Navy, Air Force, Army, intelligence agencies, any federal source that generated relevant data. Investigate, evaluate, report to Congress with unprecedented transparency. The problem is where the office was placed within the hierarchy. AARO reports to the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security, a position within the same chain of command that oversees the special access programs that Grush described. AARO is not an independent oversight body. It's an internal body to the system it's being asked to oversee. The difference between these two statuses is the difference between an internal and external auditor, and everyone who's worked in auditing knows what that means for the depth and independence of findings. The most significant limitation of AARO, the one that congressional documents themselves record, is that the office was given a mandate for total visibility over UAPs, but was explicitly denied authority to access legacy programs. The oldest SAPs, created before 2022, where, according to multiple whistleblowers including Grush, recovery and reverse engineering programs operate. AARO can see what modern reporting channels show. It cannot see what was compartmentalized before it existed. In March 2024, AARO published the Historical Record Report, Volume 1, the office's first substantive public product, compiling the history of U.S. government UAP investigations since the 1940s. It's a historically valuable document for what it reveals about the architecture of suppression. But what's most revealing about Vollefindstusleln? One is what isn't in it. There's a phrase buried in the report that, if you understand the institutional context, sounds like the loudest cry in the document. RO declares that during its historical review, it identified cases in which government officials claimed to have worked on recovery programs for material of non-human origin. But when the office attempted to obtain documentation verifying these programs, it was unable to access it. It's like an auditor saying, "We found people claiming there's embezzled money, and when we asked for access to the accounting books to verify, they told us we can't see those books." The absence of evidence in this context is not evidence of absence. It's evidence of blocked access. And blocked access, in the context of an agency with a legal mandate to review, is evidence of a deliberate separation between what exists and what can be seen. You can verify this specific point yourself. The AARO Historical Record Report, Volume 1 is public, available on the official AARO website. The language about inability to access legacy program documentation is in the body of the report. It's not my interpretation. It's what the office itself wrote about its own limitations. Look for it. Read with your own eyes what the official U.S. government UAP investigation office admits it cannot access. What Volume 1 establishes that is directly relevant to satellite archives is the data pipeline. Military orbital sensors, reconnaissance satellites, high-altitude imaging platforms, early warning systems in orbit generate data continuously. When one of these sensors records an anomalous object, the data enters a processing cycle that theoretically can reach ARO for analysis and reporting to Congress. The question that Volume 1, leaves without a satisfactory answer is, what happens to orbital sensor data collected by assets associated with the legacy SAPs that Grush described? If these programs have their own collection systems, and programs at that level of compartmentalization often have their own infrastructure, the data doesn't automatically enter the AARO pipeline. They only enter if someone inside the SAP decides they should. The satellite archives released under the NDAA 2024 didn't come out because AARO voluntarily forwarded them. They came out because the law created a mandatory review category that included orbital sensor data with unidentified objects, regardless of the data's origin. The law made the category visible to the review process even when the voluntary process would have kept that data in compartmented channels forever. If AARO couldn't access the legacy programs, how did the satellite archives reach the declassification process? That question still doesn't have an official satisfactory answer. And an open loop in institutional vocabulary is, at times, more informative than the answer that never comes. Before you see what the archives contain, you need to understand what is fundamentally different about the category of evidence we're discussing. Because this difference is the reason why these data are harder to dismiss than anything that came before in the public history of UAPs. Most people following this subject visualize evidence as a camera pointed at the sky, a pilot with onboard systems, a civilian with a cell phone, a FLIR system tracking something on the horizon. This visualization is structurally wrong for orbital data. And the structure of evidence matters as much as its content, because it's the structure that determines which criticisms are methodologically valid. Military orbital sensor data differ from any other publicly available category of UAP evidence in 4 specific dimensions. First, automatic collection. An orbital sensor doesn't decide to capture something because an operator became curious or because a pilot considered the object strange enough to point the FLIR at it. An orbital sensor collects continuously in programmed geographic strips, according to parameters that don't depend on any real-time human decision. The object that appears in the satellite data appears because it was in the sensor's coverage area, not because someone chose to document it. This characteristic eliminates the main methodological objection to conventional UAP evidence: observer selection bias. Second, Integrated and tamper-proof timestamp and geolocation. Each frame of data from an orbital sensor carries metadata that includes exactly when it was captured, from which orbital point the sensor was operating, and with what captured geometry. These metadata are generated by the system in real time and are part of the cryptographic chain of custody for the data. They're not inserted manually afterward. This means you're not estimating the size or speed of an object. You're calculating based on verified orbital parameters and geometry. The margins of error are known and documented. Third, integrated multi-sensor corroboration. Classified reconnaissance orbital platforms often operate multiple collection modes in parallel: visible optical images, short-wave infrared, long-wave infrared, and in some cases, synthetic aperture radar. An object that appears as an anomaly in multiple of these channels simultaneously cannot be dismissed as an artifact of a single sensor. To explain it as an artifact, you need simultaneous and correlated failure in multiple independent physical systems. Mathematically, this hypothesis becomes indefensible very quickly. Fourth, and this is the most underestimated point, the absence of a human decision to point the camera. Every time a UAP video from an aircraft appears, there's a valid objection. The operator already considered the object interesting enough to track it, which introduces selection bias. With orbital automatic collection, this bias doesn't exist. The object appears because it was in the sensor's coverage area. There is no human in the equation between the event and the data. Now, regarding the expedited declassification process specifically. Military orbital sensor files are classified by default above top secret. Not primarily because the observed content is sensitive, but because the precise characterization of the system's capabilities, what the sensor can distinguish, at what altitude, at what resolution, under what conditions, informs adversaries about the limitations of American reconnaissance. It's the justification of sources and methods, and it is real and legitimate. What the expedited process of the 2024 NDAA specifically allows is to redact sources and methods information while releasing the anomalous data. In concrete terms, you can see what the sensor recorded, but the public report may not specify exactly which orbital platform captured the data, in what orbit, or what the maximum resolution of the system was under those conditions. The object's signature is preserved for public analysis. The instrument specifications can be partially protected. The files that were released do not cover a single incident. They cover multiple documented events over a period of years, objects observed in multiple satellite passes, under different geographic and temporal conditions, exhibiting consistent signature and behavioral characteristics. This consistency across observations separated by time and space is the element that makes conventional explanations progressively harder to sustain. An experimental drone might appear once near a test facility. A rare atmospheric phenomenon might produce a sensor signature under specific conditions. But the same object profile, the same signature characteristics, the same behavioral envelope appearing in multiple observations, across diverse geographies, over an extended period. That is none of these cases. For conventional hypotheses, you need to explain not a single event, but a pattern. And patterns require systematic explanations, not isolated coincidences. I'm going to be direct about what we know and what we don't know about the specific content of this footage. The released data were submitted to technical analysis within the review process before public release. Classified briefings on this data were presented to members of congressional oversight committees. What emerged from those briefings and what was described by analysts who reviewed the material with access to classified reference databases is what I'm going to describe. I'm not making up specifications. I'm reporting what the declassification process and the documented briefings revealed. And that distinction matters for the integrity of what we're doing here. The footage begins as completely routine sensor data, a grid of thermal data in the infrared range, the characteristic grayscale tones of orbital sensor imagery that any reconnaissance analyst would see dozens of times a week. Ocean floor at high altitude, cloud layers, water surface temperature, completely ordinary past data. And then, in a region of the frame that the sensor covered by routine programming, something appears that shouldn't be there. The first anomaly that analysts identified, and which appears in the briefings as the initial element of analysis, is the thermal signature. Jet-powered vehicles produce directional heat plumes. The emission source and the thermal trail behind it are recognizable and cataloged in extensive reference databases. Rocket-powered vehicles have flame signatures with equally specific patterns. The object in the released data exhibits a thermal signature that analysts describe as different from any category in those databases. The heat appears distributed around the object in a way that doesn't correspond to directional propulsion of any documented type. No plume, no trail, no emission point with conventional geometry. This detail matters more than it appears at first glance. Infrared detection systems on orbital platforms have been extensively calibrated against all types of objects that fly in the atmosphere: commercial aircraft, military aircraft, missiles, rockets, high-altitude balloons, hypersonic vehicles. The signatures are documented. A signature that doesn't correspond to any category in the database is not simply strange. It's a categorical anomaly, something outside the mapped space of possibilities. The second element that the briefings describe is the movement profile. During the initial period of sensor coverage, the object maintains a velocity and altitude that, in itself, could have a conventional explanation. What analysts couldn't explain is what happens next. The object executes an abrupt vector change followed by acceleration to velocities that the sensor's orbital parameters allow us to calculate as far beyond the envelope of any known aircraft, including experimental hypersonic vehicles, whose signatures and performance envelopes are documented internally at agencies with access to those programs. To contextualize this performance, the SR-71 Blackbird, the sustained speed record for American aircraft, flew at approximately 3,500 kilometers per hour. Experimental hypersonic vehicles have achieved test speeds above 11,000 kilometers mph, but in controlled ballistic trajectories, not in sustained maneuver with vector change. What the satellite data shows, according to the briefings, is in a category beyond those references in terms of the combination of velocity and sustained maneuver. The acceleration issue is where the physical problem becomes harder to work around. For any object of a size detectable by orbital sensor to accelerate in the manner described in the briefings, the g-forces on any structure or occupant within conventional physical parameters would be incompatible with system or occupant survival. Furthermore, acceleration at those rates through the atmosphere would generate friction heat that should be clearly visible in infrared channels. This heat does not appear in the data with the signature corresponding to the described acceleration. Analysts rigorously tested the sensor artifact hypothesis because it is the responsible conservative hypothesis and is always the first to be tested. Sensor artifacts have specific signatures: pixel patterns, noise behavior, dependence on instrument operating conditions. The object in the data exhibits behavior inconsistent with known artifacts across multiple channels. More critically, it appears in correlated fashion across multiple collection modes in a way that a processing artifact cannot produce. A software error affects one processing channel. A detector failure affects one detector area. What the data shows appears across independent physical channels in ways that the artifact hypothesis does not statistically accommodate. The comparison analysts established with the Nimitz, gimbal, and Go Fast footage from 2004 and 2015 is deliberate and informative. Each of those cases exhibited one or two isolated anomalous characteristics that a sufficiently motivated skeptic could explain with individual hypotheses. The hypotheses were not convincing to experts, but were technically possible as alternative explanations for isolated cases. What the satellite data adds is the overlay of multiple simultaneous anomalies that would need to be explained together. An unprecedented thermal signature and a maneuver profile that violates conventional physics and acceleration without corresponding friction heat and correlated multi-channel behavior. Each of these anomalies individually has a defensible conventional hypothesis. The combination of all of them simultaneously for the same object puts the conventional hypothesis in a mathematically untenable position. The specific element that the briefings identify as most resistant to any conventional explanation. The central point of the analysis is the object's behavior immediately before the main acceleration. According to the briefing descriptions, at a specific moment in the data sequence, the object exhibits the equivalent of zero velocity relative to the sensor reference frame. At altitude and conditions where any physical object of any size would be subject to gravity and atmospheric drag. And then, without gradual transition, without a period of progressive acceleration, it begins high-velocity movement. If you're watching this and thinking, I'm exaggerating, analysts who reviewed this data with access to the most complete reference databases of the American government reached the same conclusion described in the briefings. The same numbers, the same profile, the same absence of explanation within known systems. There is no documented way to build a vehicle that does this. Not with known materials, not with known propulsion physics, not with known aerodynamic geometry. The analysts who reached this conclusion have access to classified projects the public does not know about. The conclusion is not, this doesn't look like anything the public has seen. It is, this doesn't look like anything in our databases. This is why members of congressional committees who received briefings on this data chose the words they chose when speaking publicly. They didn't say the data was interesting or intriguing. They said there was substantial material to be reviewed, that there was more context needed, and that the implications were significant. That is the language of elected representatives trying to be responsible with classified information while signaling to the public that what they saw was genuinely extraordinary. Grush told Congress on July 26, 2023, that the American government possesses vehicles of non-human origin with performance characteristics that do not correspond to any known human engineering technology, that he had reviewed documentation establishing this, that there was personnel within the government who had worked directly with these vehicles. The satellite data provided by the 2024 NDAA shows an object with performance characteristics that do not correspond to any known human engineering technology. Let's map each Grush statement against what the data revealed. Not beyond what the data supports, but precisely to where they reach. The first statement, vehicles of non-human origin in government custody, is indirectly supported by the footage in the following way. If the government has orbital sensor data documenting objects with this performance profile, and if that data was classified, and if the classification was actively maintained over decades despite mounting pressure, then someone within the system recognized the significance of what was being captured and made active decisions to keep that recognition in compartmentalized channels. Data from drones, balloons, or experimental aircraft from proprietary government programs do not receive decades of classification protection that withstands congressional legislation. Data on objects that contradict documented physics, that have no analog in the world's most comprehensive classified reference databases, receive exactly that treatment. The level of protection is, in itself, evidence that whoever made the classification decisions knew that what was being protected was not mundane. Grush's second claim, active reverse engineering programs within SAPs is not directly confirmed by satellite data. The imagery documents that objects with this profile exist in government data. It does not document what happens when the government detects or eventually recovers these objects. But the logic of the implication is clear. Any functional intelligence agency that accumulates decades of sensor data documenting objects with inexplicable physical characteristics will inevitably initiate some form of analysis program. The evidence that this data existed and was protected is consistent with the existence of the programs Grush described. It does not directly prove their existence. It makes that existence considerably more likely than unlikely. The third claim, institutional disinformation campaign, is validated by government behavior in response to the release, not by the content of the data itself. The pattern, the Pentagon, following the release of the satellite files, published a statement that did not deny the content of the data. It did not say the object was a drone, a balloon, an atmospheric phenomenon, or a sensor artifact. It said the phenomenon remains unidentified and that analysis continues. ARO said essentially the same. Members of the House Oversight Committees and the Senate Intelligence Committee who received classified briefings said they could not comment specifically on the content, but that there was more substantial material in the pipeline. This pattern of calculated non-denial is consistent with what you would expect from institutions that have maintained active disinformation for decades and now must navigate the declassification process without explicitly confirming what they attempted to suppress. You do not deny what you cannot credibly deny. You choose vocabulary that leaves all technological possibilities technically open while preventing the press from writing the most direct headline. The fourth claim, coercion and retaliation against personnel, is partially validated by the timeline of the information itself. If data with this profile existed in government satellite systems for years, and if analysts who processed this data inevitably recognized the anomaly, the absence of leaks prior to Grush's testimony is not evidence that the data was not significant. It is evidence that the containment system was effective enough to prevent people who knew from reaching the public for more than a generation. What was not corroborated by the satellite data, and it is important to be precise about this, are the more specific aspects of the claims about physical recovery of intact vehicles and reverse engineering programs with identifiable facilities and personnel. These elements remain in the category of human testimony without public documentary corroboration. The satellite data establishes that objects with the described profile exist in government records. What happens when the government finds these objects under conditions that permit physical recovery remains undocumented publicly. This distinction between what the data proves directly, what it makes more plausible, and what it has yet to touch is what separates credible analysis from speculation that collapses under scrutiny. And it is important to make it because what the data proves directly is already extraordinary enough to not need exaggeration. What the first footage proves you were right means with precision. It proves that the performance profile that the UAP community identified as the marker of technology beyond current human engineering. Maneuver that violates known inertia, signature with no match in known propulsion, acceleration without corresponding physical consequences, exists in the sensor data of American orbital satellites. The government knew these objects existed. The data was there, captured automatically, stored in satellite systems, processed by analysts who recognized what they were seeing. For decades, while enthusiasts were categorized as movie lunatics, while military pilots were advised not to report sightings for fear of professional consequences, while serious researchers were isolated from the institutions that could give weight to their findings, the satellites kept collecting. The data kept accumulating. And somewhere within the world's most sophisticated classification system, there were people who knew exactly what was being documented. The change that this footage represents is not that UAPs exist. That was officially acknowledged in 2021. The change is more profound. It is the shift from the phenomenon is real to the decision to hide was real. If the data existed and was maintained and was classified and congressional legislation was required to move it, then there was no ignorance. There was decision. Active, sustained decision with institutional resources dedicated to it. That is the claim that cannot be undone by the next Department of Defense statement. What the release of satellite files establishes as legal fact is that the disclosure pipeline is open and legally binding. The question is no longer whether more files will come. The question is in what order, with what level of redaction of sources and methods, and within what timeline. What's in the pipeline for the next 12 months goes beyond orbital sensor data. The 2024 NDAA clause covers multiple categories of record. Historical investigation reports covering decades of events that never received satisfactory public explanation. Interagency communications between Air Force, Navy, CIA, NSA, and other agencies when UAP incidents crossed their jurisdictions. Documentation associated with specific programs identified during the review process. Each category has its own classification review process and its own timeline. The satellite files were first because they are the most technically definable category. What comes next is more complicated and will take longer, but is in the process with legal backing. To follow this closely, the right places are not DoD press releases. They are the hearings of the House Oversight Committees and the Senate Intelligence Committee where real accountability happens, where members who received classified briefings make publicly cautious statements that, read correctly, signal what's coming. Learn to read what is absent as much as what is present. Organizations using the Freedom of Information Act to litigate against the Department of Defense are the channel where documents appear before the news. The NDAA clause changed their leverage. Files that could previously be denied with the standard national security justification now have legal counterweight that lawyers can use to force review of denials. Following these processes is, at the moment, one of the most concrete ways to know what is entering and what is exiting the declassification process. That frame in the files, what analysts describe as physically impossible within everything we know, spent years locked in some classified system while the world debated whether there was anything to see. Now you've seen it, and now you know why they didn't want you to see it. The question that the coming years will answer is what exactly they found, when they found it, and why they decided that humanity didn't need to know. What's coming will be more significant than what has been released so far. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any file that comes out of this pipeline. Stay alert.